My name is Peter Wolanin. I work mostly on Drupal, but I've been working with Solr also for the last several years, primarily integrating Drupal together with Solr. So this talk, while somewhat about Drupal and just to kind of give you an idea of why you might want to use it, is also going to dive in a bit to the integration we have, and I want to tell you a bit about why you should consider using sort of this combination for your next project. Especially if you're here at the conference and you haven't integrated Solr with a website yet. I think that this combination of Drupal plus Solr is really powerful and will get you very far along very quickly. So I have an agenda. And let's see, I might have to adjust my slides, but hopefully that'll be all right. Basically, I want to tell you a little bit about Drupal and why we see a lot of companies standardizing on it. So it's a free enterprise, both content management framework, but also web application framework. And really, the use of it as an application framework is in some ways more really what it's suited to than a pure CMS. So it's not, people sometimes get frustrated when they enable it that it's not giving them every bell and whistle of a CMS, but really that's its orientation on the back end is more of an application framework. So Drupal has a large community of contributors, and basically all the code you'll find for Drupal is free. It's under the GPL, so you can very quickly get started. You don't have to pay licensing fees or maintenance fees for any of the code you find. And we have spent a lot of time integrating Drupal with Solr, so just by installing Solr and installing Drupal, you get a great combination of features right out of the box without doing any coding. And so I'm hoping that you'll leave here convinced that you should at least try this out next time you have an appropriate project. In terms of what's in this talk, just tell you a little bit why we see organizations deciding that they need to standardize on Drupal. Tell you about some of the integration, including the content indexing, generation of facets, some of the UI configuration options, and then talk a little bit about the code level. So if you need to go beyond the UI, what you can do in code. But really, the take-home message I want you to have is that you don't have to do anything in code. So a lot of the talks here at the conference, it's sort of like, you hear people go on and then they get to a point and then you have to write some Java to make this work, right? So what I'm here to tell you is we've done a lot of work so that you really have to write zero code. It's really just turning it on and it'll work. And you can write code if you need to, but that's not the majority use case. Why are organizations thinking about Drupal? So in terms of competing to convince organizations, when they're starting a new website, we go in and compete now against a lot of commercial software, so against Jive, against Adobe products, against Oracle products, and we see organizations have that entire range of software installed, as well as multiple free open source, web content management or web building software. So within the organization, they have a totally fractured experience. Their IT department can't help the individual marketing or other departments that have installed these different software products because they're so fractured. So really the web is broken for these organizations in the sense that they can't manage it in a sort of sustainable way for their organization. One of our pushes is to encourage people, and we see this happening with a lot of organizations. So organizations like National Public Radio, organizations like the Peace Corps, they have a lot of different sites, for every country, for every station. For large companies that do marketing, so Sony Music, Universal Music, Warner Music, they have hundreds of different artists they have to support, and if every artist or every marketing department is on a different platform, it basically becomes impossible for them to maintain. By standardizing, they get to take advantage of what Drupal has to offer, which is a very large market presence already for free software. We've actually gone out and crawled the web and counted the number of public Drupal sites, so we can tell you with hard data that there's over 1.5 million Drupal sites out there running all across the world. And if you go to Drupal.org, which is kind of the home of the project, you can download a huge number of contributed modules. You'll see we just broke 1 million registered users on that site. And there's 17,000, depending on what metric you want to use, active developers. So contributing in some way or another their code to the public, to the general public good under the GPL. So you can take that and use that, if not as the final solution, at least as a starting point anytime you have a problem you need to tackle. So because of all these contributed modules, Drupal itself has a fairly small core functionality, and then you can add on to it to basically integrate it with anything you need to integrate. It has a very flexible architecture. You can build almost any type of site you want, which is why we see organizations standardizing on it. They can start building blog things. They can build an interactive fan site. They can build an e-commerce site. They can build a marketing brochureware site. So all these things can be built using Drupal, and then it allows basically their IT department to manage all of it. It's one standard platform, and then the marketing and other departments can build whatever sites they want on top of that standard platform. So, as an example, again, of why Drupal brings you real advantages as sort of this open and flexible platform, if we look at the history of emerging sort of web phenomenon, something like Pinterest, when it hit 10 million unique visitors, it was a little over a year ago. Basically, people in the Drupal community got interested, said, hey, this is some new phenomenon. It's not something I personally do, but a lot of people have been very excited about it over the last year. So within a month, someone posted a project, integrate with the Pinterest API. And within 2 months of that, there were 15 Drupal sites that went live with Pinterest integration so they could show their users pinned photos. Now, if you think about a commercial software product, how many of them would have rolled out even beta functionality that quickly to you for free? So to take advantage of this new phenomenon. So if that Pinterest was important to your users, within 2 months you could have basically gone live with something that allowed your users on the Drupal site to pull in their Pinterest photos. So now getting to the things you really care about, of course, is the integration with Apache Solr. So we've been working on the integration between Drupal and Apache Solr now for over 5 years. So we've had that integration working in 3 different major versions of Drupal. If we look across the different integration modules, there's over 20,000 sites that are reporting back to Drupal.org that they actually have these modules enabled. So this is not this is sort of a lower bound of sites that are willing to report back their statistics. And an active community of contributors that help fix bugs. So, I kind of want to put these numbers up because I think they're pretty large compared to what you see in the Solr community in terms of using one given integration. So this is really a well-tested integration. It's used by all these sites, and you can go back and look at all the things we fixed, all of the features we added, and you can contribute yourself to the project. So the advantage of using this sort of pre-built integration, of course, is that we've already spent a lot of time solving the hardest problems in the space. So I would say that the hardest problem of all, and may not sound like it, is actually content indexing. So figuring out how to index content, how to keep track of what content has been updated, and just managing that because, for example, your content may be updated several times before you have a chance to send it up to the Solr server. Yeah? Sure. Right, content in Drupal. Right. Yep. So just also talk a bit about, well, I'll talk more about facets. We have sorting and highlighting turned on, and we have integrated more like this in spell check. So you can just turn on basically the feature for more like this and help users find similar content. We also have a system we can turn on. Drupal has a content access system, and you can basically turn on a module that will mirror all those content permissions into the Solr search index so that your search results, as you would think you would naturally want, would be filtered by the same permissions as the content the user is browsing on the site. And because we work to make this sort of a generic module, at this point you can use it with pretty much any of the supported versions of Solr. We started really with Solr 1.4, was just coming out while it was still in beta, and have it working through Solr 4 series. So to tell you a little bit more about Drupal, so Drupal has really, as I said, it's sort of a web application framework more than a content management system, and in that sense, tend to treat content really as data more than as just a blob of text. So we have nodes, or the name we give the sort of basic content entity, and they're very flexible. We can extend them. We can represent lots of different data using nodes. Beyond text, we can represent geographic locations. We can represent relationships with other nodes. pretty much anything you want, and I'll show you a little bit more about that. So within the UI, site builders can come in and define all those data fields. So I think this is one of the real powers of Drupal, is that, again, we've moved more and more towards a system where you don't need to have any experience coding in order to completely configure this complex data model for your website. So you can come in and define as many content types as you need. You can come in and define data fields for all those content types. And those data fields can be reused across the site in extremely powerful ways. You can make listings, you can make cross-references. You can use basically subsections of your data and slice and dice them. I think this is really great for someone who has in their mind sort of this notion of behind the scenes, the relational data. You can basically pull all those relationships out just using tools in the user interface and reuse the content, reuse the subset sections of data. So for example, you don't have to post a block listing your event and also post the events on the calendar and also post the full text of the event on different web pages. You basically just have to post that data once, and then you can reuse it in all three of those locations, the same data. So what does that look like? If you go into the UI, you'll see here that at the bottom it just says add new field, and you can basically within that pick, I want a date, I want a text field, I want the Boolean value, I want a new image. So right here, this is this gives you tremendous flexibility, and there's more modules that add additional field types on top of sort of the standard ones that ship with Drupal. So we've got dynamic content types, we've got dynamic data fields, and the Drupal module basically has a pipeline that knows how to take in this dynamic data, process it, and send it to Solr. So each Drupal entity, in this case, typically a node, which is, as I said, our standard content object, is processed. So we send it through callbacks, and this is a place where you can intervene, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. So if you need to write custom code, you can intervene in this process and customize it, but there's sort of a standard workflow. We process each of these node objects into a document object, which is still in PHP in memory, and we serialize it to XML, send it to Solr, and it gets into your index. And we basically have a queue, or sort of queue-like structure that maintains a history of what was most recently indexed, when it was updated, and therefore, generally we have Drupal set up, so every few minutes it will just run through, pick off the most recent things that need to be indexed, and send them to Solr, so it becomes a totally automatic process, as long as you know that you have to wait for this indexing delay. You certainly could set this up with Solr Cloud and have something faster, sort of because we've historically gone from Solr 1.4 through the present. We haven't spent a lot of time getting near real-time integrated fully, but it's also, in our experience, such a narrow use case for people. I mean, a few high-profile news sites need it, but most people are perfectly happy if their content's available within a few minutes in the search. Within this pipeline, you also can control some of it within the UI without writing custom code. So Drupal has this concept of different displays for your content, and one of the modes for display you can pick is the search index. And so you can actually go into the search index display mode if you turn it on. Then you could, for example, decide to hide anything about the image field if you didn't want it, or if there's some other field where you didn't want the text related to that data to go into the full text search in Solr, you could actually suppress it on this field, or suppress it on in this UI. So I think that's something that again is very powerful, allows you to customize what turns up in your full text search without doing any coding. Okay, so as I said, we have dynamic data. In order to manage this, we need a lot of dynamic schema fields. So if you use Solr a little bit, you may or may not be familiar with dynamic schema fields. This is the approach we've taken. So rather than requiring you, for example, to write out a schema every time you change your content model, instead, we provide a schema that has a lot of dynamic fields predefined, and then we have a mechanism for mapping those content data fields into dynamic schema fields of the right data type. So as the data structure is user-defined, we have to have a sort of automatic mapping. If you need to do something special, if you need to do a different mapping, you certainly can. You can just write a few lines of code and change that mapping for a specific field. But generally, the default will work fine. And since we provide the standard schema XML, standard Solr config XML, the consumers of this Drupal module are generally not Solr experts. And so for them, it's much more maintainable to have a totally standard schema that they don't have to make any tweaks to and simply can deploy. And if we need to add some new feature to it for the module, we can do that, and we provide those configs for Solr 1.4, for Solr 3, and for Solr 4. So just, you probably know what this looks like. Sorry, that's a little cut off there. But we use generally dynamic fields with prefixes. So you'll see the first one is SS underscore, and that stands for a string with a single value. Second one, SM, string with multiple values. Go on down the line, text with single value, text with multiple values. If you open up the schema, you see we have a huge number of these, probably about 40 or 50 defined. So really, almost every type of Solr data field that we thought was going to be useful, we've gone ahead and made a dynamic field. So even if we don't actually use it anywhere in the module mapping, if you need it in your custom code, you can take advantage of it without having to customize the schema. So further advantage of Drupal knowing about all these data fields is that we can use them to provide you with automatic facets. So some of the standard facets that you get out of the box are faceting by content type, by taxonomy terms. So Drupal has a very powerful taxonomy system. You can associate one or more taxonomies with each content type. Facet by author, facet by date. And if you post data that are things that are sort of suitable for faceting, things like lists of numbers, lists of text, values that you might pick in a select box, we'll make those automatically available for you as facets also. So again, you get these nice blocks where you can filter down author or content type, again, just by enabling them in the UI. You don't have to code them. You don't even have to think about what's going on behind the scenes. So Drupal just has a big page where you turn on these modules. So we have basically a framework module, a search module that provides search pages, and then a facet API module that provides facets. So you'll want all three of these if you want the full features I'm talking about here. And once you've done that, and here I had already a localhost server running, so it connected up automatically, just to what the Jetty port would be. And the sort of overview screen here shows you, how much content is indexed, how much remains to be indexed, the name of the schema file. So there's actually an XML property that gives you the name, and we've put values in there to let you sort of understand the version of the schema that you're using that corresponds to the module version. And we set an auto commit value in the one we ship to basically encourage people to index a bunch of content before it gets committed. Again, back to our earlier experience with Solr 1.4, where committing all the time was a real disaster. So that tells you right there about the auto commit time that's built into the Solr config. If we click on the next tab, we'll see that we have both pages and more like this blocks. And in sort of analogy to data fields, we can actually add search pages. We can add search blocks just by clicking those links at the top where it says add search page, add search block. So you can define a new search page. Your search page can, for example, be pre-filtered. It could limit search to certain content types, or you could exclude certain content types. You could filter. If you turn on that second one there, we have as an example, it will filter based on taxonomies. So you can actually essentially have what looks like a taxonomy listing page, which is turned into a full text search pre-filtered by a given taxonomy term. And then if your site's very taxonomy driven, it could be very useful for helping users find things within those categories. More like this, I'm not going to go into too much, but if you turn on that block, you can configure it so when you're viewing a piece of content, it will automatically find other content on the site that's similar based on keywords in the body of the text. If I go over here and look at my environments, similar sort of setup. I can add multiple search environments. Really, you typically just need one. An environment describes both a connection to a Solr server, so you can actually manage connections to multiple servers. As well, it contains, essentially, is a container for the configuration over on the right there, which is about your index, your facets, your bias settings. So if you need to, for example, have one search page with one set of facets or biases and a different search page with a different set of facets and biases, you just click that clone button over there, get a copy of your current environment, tweak those settings, those values for your needs, and continue as many times as you need to. So within the edit, I can just rename this so it becomes a little more intuitive. What I'm looking at, again, Main settings you need to connect to Solr, just a URL. Of course, Solr being HTTP doesn't need anything else. And we include within the module the ability to toggle a given environment to be read-only. We don't really have any integration with this, but if you have, for example, a dev staging production workflow, you could potentially just automatically change this value during your workflow, so you could set your development environment to be read-only, but still run searches against the production environment. Obviously, there's more sophisticated ways you could do this, but again, this is just for people who need something that works very easily out of the box. If I go and look at the facets, I have things as, again, like the author facet. All I have to do is click that on and save it at the bottom of the page, or I can go in and configure it. And the Facet API module provides a huge number of options for facets. So if you've had to build facets, maybe this would be a little bit of a revelation to you, that you can basically have all these options for you. How many to display, what style to display them in, what order to sort them in, all available here without, again, doing any coding. Just as an example for the author, I think the author might be a nice facet to use as an OR facet rather than an AND facet. So by default, you pick a facet, it will restrict to only content matching that facet. That's an AND facet. If you pick an OR facet, each time you select a facet, it actually expands your search results. So it would say this author or the other author. So when I do that, I like to change the display, and I choose the second one there, which is the checkbox style. To me, that's sort of intuitive as expand out my selection. If I scroll to the bottom of the page, I can just turn this from AND to OR and hit save. When that's saved, I can go and then configure this facet block, put it in whatever part of the page I want to have it show on. And basically, that's what it looks like. If I type in some fake Latin, then I get fake Latin results. But you see I have these author facets now that look like checkboxes. If I check one, it will filter down to just that author, but then I'll have the option to check additional ones and expand out my search results to all the authors that I've selected. In contrast, the content type I've left as the default links style. So if I pick a content type, in this case, based on my configuration, it will only filter down to that one content type. So this is sort of, again, this you get out of the box. I didn't have to do anything except enable Drupal, write some content, turn on these modules, and configure them. So that's really the advantage this integration gives you. Sort of the take-home message, these things are fully built. We spent a lot of time on this integration. As I said, it's been basically working on it over multiple Drupal versions for 5 years. So you can build these search pages, you can build facets with no coding. You can tune your boost, you can tune your query fields, apply other configuration, and then, and only then, if that doesn't meet your needs, you can go in and think about writing custom code. Now, since this is more of a tech-heavy conference, I dedicated the last part of the talk to talking a little bit about utilizing the Drupal API to change the search results. But I sort of want to stop here and just make it very clear that the stuff I'm talking about from here on is totally optional, and it's when you want to get some advanced behavior that doesn't work out of the box, and everything that I've shown you up to now, you wouldn't have to look at the code at all. So how do we extend things in Drupal? So Drupal has this concept of modules, and modules are really the basic building block of any custom functionality. And within each module, we have a system that's called the hook system, which is basically just a naming pattern for functions. And if you see here the example where I have the capital HOOK, you just replace that with the name of your module, and then Drupal would know to call your module at the appropriate point during the code flow. So it's really, once you get your head around it, very simple to work with. So you just create a Drupal module in PHP. PHP looks enough like Java that if you're a Java developer, you can write it very easily as long as you don't worry about types. So once you've done this, so for example, this hook I'm showing you here allows you to modify the data before it gets sent to the Solr index. So if you want to add more data fields, you want to remove data fields, you want to change them, you can do that using this hook. We have other hooks that allow you to modify the search results and their appearance. So really from end to end, you can intervene in any part of this code flow and customize it for your needs. So what is the sort of in terms of customizing the search and response, what does that look like? So we have a query object that we've basically wrapped all the communication with Solr goes through this query object. So the query object basically prepares all the parameters that go to Solr, and then it has inside of it embedded an object that knows how to connect to the Solr server over HTTP. So within the normal flow, if I have a search page, this hook, Apache Solr query prepare, where you get called and you get passed a query object, you can call methods on it. So if you know the Solr API, for example, you want to change the highlighting parameters, you can just set those parameters. If you need to interrogate what parameters have already been set, you can call get parameter. And when you're ready, you can just invoke the search method, and this will get you a result object that has basically a decoded data structure representing the result that came back from Solr. One of the things that I want to mention, because if you dive into this, you'll notice that there are two hooks that look almost the same but do slightly different things. So if you're tweaking the query, for example, one of the most common things is to add extra FL parameters. So you want more data returned from the Solr index, you need to add an extra FL parameter. Or you might want to filter the data. So you want to restrict, for some reason, what your users are seeing in the index. So we have these two different Drupal hooks that really run one right after the other. The first one I showed you is the prepare hook. That's invoked before we cache this query object. Basically, we use that cache version to render things like the facet blocks. So the things that are in the cache version are potentially exposed to users. They may show up as URL query parameters. It may show up, for example, as visible sorts in the sort block. So those are all things that really, if you want to differentiate, the prepare hook is when you do things that you may want the user to see or be able to affect. And then this alter hook is called after that. That's done after we save the query. That's the time where you do something like access controls. So you don't want the user to be able to remove the access filters that you apply to the query. You don't want them to appear in the query string of the Drupal site. So those we add in this later phase, and then the user, they don't get carried over into the later rendering phase, and so the user doesn't ever have the opportunity to see them or interact with them. So just sort of a slightly advanced note, but if you start tweaking Drupal, be aware of that distinction. Then to go a little more into, as I said, preparing a document for indexing. I don't know if any of you saw Eric Hatcher's talk yesterday, where he talked about poor man's entity extraction. If not, he has a blog post there. One of the things I wanted to point out is that some of the features there are only available in the latest couple versions of Solr. So depending on what version of Solr you're running on, you may have thought, well, I want to do that, but I don't know how to. So what I want to show you is an example of shifting that work to do the work in the Drupal module before we actually send the content to Solr. So then I can make it work for any version of Solr that interacts with this sort of standard API. And I can just deploy this to my existing Drupal site, and I don't have to touch the Solr server. So again, my experience is that there's a lot of people running Drupal sites, and the Solr server may be run by a totally different part of the organization, or they may even use it as a service. There's a lot more work for them to tweak the schema, to tweak the Solr config, than it is for them to add a little bit of code to the Drupal site. I posted up the code. Complete code I'm going to show is already posted publicly. Of course, you'll have the slides, so you can go find the URL if you're interested. So first part is adding a new field with matched strings. So one of the examples that Eric talks about in that blog post is matching key phrases within a document. So what I did here was basically, this code is a little bit simplified from what's actually in the module. Just for readability, it's a few extra lines, but this is the essential parts of it. So we have this hook, Apache Solr index document build node, which is very specific. So if I'm building content to send to Solr from a node entity, this hook would get called. I can get basically a variable that has stored any key phrases that I'm interested in. I can basically iterate over them, using a case-insensitive search, find if that phrase appears anywhere in the document. If it does, then I add it to the field, to SM, which is a string multi-value field. I add this phrase, and because it's a string field, it's suitable for faceting. Great. I can also in contrast to having to save a text file to your server, I can just build very easily a form in Drupal that allows you to type in whatever your key phrases are. I also added the acronym feature that's talked about in the blog post. So we're looking for 3-letter or longer capitalized with potentially periods in between them entities inside the text. So if I check that box, I will also extract any acronyms or acronym-like patterns I see in the text. So again, this saves you from having to spend any time managing your server. You just do it on the Drupal side. And I also want, as I said, to provide facets for it. So I need to tell the facet API module that it should facet on this field. This, again, I cut out a couple lines that aren't really essential to understanding what's going on. But essentially, I'm just checking if the search module that I'm interested in is the Apache Solr module. Then I facet, and by default, the key of that array is the name of the field. So this SM key phrases that you saw on the previous slide. Give it a label and a description. The rest all goes to defaults that work reasonably well for something like this. And now that module will provide a facet block. You can do the same thing for those acronyms. And so now I get 2 facet blocks, one for my key phrases and one for my acronyms. Again, you can go through, enable those. I put them in the left sidebar this time. Some fake Latin text and a few acronyms that I added, or acronym-like strings. And you see that those 3 key phrases that I typed into my configuration form now appear in the block. I can filter down to just content that contains those. Similarly with acronyms, the acronyms, I'm not showing it here, but I actually stripped out, in contrast to Eric's example, I actually strip out dots also. So I had one piece of content where it was, NIH with dots, and one piece of content where it was NIH without dots. And now we've collapsed it down to a single facet. Actually, I guess it's just one here that had this fake Latin word in it. But same with USA. I did one with dots and one without dots, and it collapses them down to just one facet. So that kind of extraction and manipulation is very easy to do. As you see, you just need to write a few lines of that PHP, add, for example, a string field, and you can readily enable a new facet with just those few lines of code. Let me wrap up here and leave some time for questions. So basically, the take-home point, again, is that we have this extensive integration built between Apache Solr and Drupal. It's highly customizable, and you have a large community of contributors both around Apache Solr and around the Apache Solr integration and around Drupal more broadly. It allows you to really develop a very sophisticated, very feature-complete website very quickly compared to building something from scratch. I work for Acquia, so part of why I'm here is I just like to encourage people to try using Drupal. If you need support for Drupal, we provide Drupal support and services. And as part of that, we also include hosted Solr. So if you don't have Solr already up and running, you want to try it together with Drupal, we actually have a free tier of web hosting now, so you can set up a free hosted Drupal site with a free hosted Solr index and try all this stuff out. So that's it for me, and I'd be happy to take your questions. Yes, so Acquia does worldwide support. So we have an office in outside London in Reading. We have several people in Europe, mostly remotely located, France, Germany, several different places. So we do provide support around the world. And then we have 2 offices in the United States. Our main office is in the Boston area, and we have an office in Portland. And then we have a few people that do support and operations that are in Australia. So we've been trying to expand, our worldwide base, so we can basically provide 24-hour support for people. Okay, so the question is, this gentleman has a collection of data in Solr. It's not Drupal data per se, but they're using Drupal basically as an authentication and presentation layer. I mean, to me, that's an important use case. So it's not the most typical case, but it's definitely a use case that we have worked with. So we have museums, for example, that will have their art collection is indexed into Solr out of some legacy database, and then they have Drupal content, let's say, indexed separately. I have So this is the module I just posted. There's also a module I posted which is basically an examples module, and one of the examples is just trying to give you an idea of how you could make Solr work with an external data source. I mean, so there's definitely some better ways you could set it up. One of the features I didn't talk about here was multi-site search. So within we have a module that just adds a little bit on top of what these base modules do, and basically allows you to index multiple Drupal sites into one Solr index, and then to potentially facet or filter out content from the different sites depending on your needs. So you can essentially, you could, for example, index 10 sites into one index, and one site is your portal that searches across all 10, and the other 9 sites only search their own data using all of the same Solr index. But the same system that supports that also lets you pretty easily work with external data depending on exactly what you want to do with it. So you could even segment sort of your Drupal content from your external content if, depending on, it'd be helpful if you control the indexing process, and you can set up some extra fields that Drupal expects. So this examples module, one of the things that I did recently, just because I was sort of curious, one of my colleagues was using Nutch to crawl data, and so I wrote an example module here that you're welcome to look at that just shows how would you basically manage telling Drupal about this other source of data in the Solr index. It was really, I mean, I called it sort of a Nutch integration module, but it's really a integrate with anything that's external to Drupal kind of module. And it just, again, indexes a little bit of metadata and lets you apply a little bit of extra filtering that wouldn't necessarily be obvious how to do out of the box. So anyway, if you're interested, you can come here and find this module, which, I mean, this again talks about Nutch and using it for Nutch integration, but it would work perfectly fine with any way that you get data into your index. So I don't know if that helps, or you have more specific questions. So the current version of Drupal is very procedural. So I mean, we are passing objects around for these data, both the initial data and then the thing we serialize into XML. But as far as how you would resolve those conflicts, so there's a couple things. So Drupal allows you to actually change the order in which these functions are called for different modules. So if you need yours to go first or you need yours to go last, you can basically tell Drupal about that and reorder them. Other than there's sort of natural orders that just runs them in alphabetical order by module name, which is the silliest thing you can think of, but it's better than nothing. So if you need something different, you can do that. The version of Drupal that's under development that'll be out sometime next year, Drupal 8, is going to convert a lot of this code to be more class-based. So in that case, you will actually have the ability to substitute a lot of times an implementation with something with the same interface. And so that's going to open up a world of really tremendous flexibility if you need to do something custom. But right now, you can do a couple things. So you could reorder, or in fact, instead of reordering, you could prevent some other modules function from getting called altogether if you need to. And by doing that, you can basically, once you've found the conflict, you can pretty easily resolve it. As far as function naming, as I said, you basically always name things with the name of your module as the leading part. So PHP otherwise is pretty unforgiving. If you have the same function twice, it has a fatal error. So you can't do that. In our current phase, as sort of the major Drupal releases are 2 to 3 years apart, and each Drupal release is supported for 2 releases, basically. So, typically if you roll out a site, you'll have, in the worst case, 4 or 5 years, and then you might have to think about rewriting some of your code. So it is an issue, and I think it'll be interesting to see with the change towards a more object-oriented code in Drupal 8 that there may be a greater preservation of compatibility between versions because we can now actually define an interface instead of having just a list of functions to call, which you can't really enforce. But with an interface, you can essentially enforce that contract in a way that gives you more backward compatibility. No other questions? Thank you guys for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the conference.